Good evening, and welcome back to the Midnight Archive. There are places in this world that seem to stand outside of time. Ancient castles, perched on lonely crags, their stones saturated with the whispers of the past. They are repositories of history, of legend, and of secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. We tell ourselves these are just bricks and mortar, but some walls have memories. Some castles have souls. Tonight, we invite you to a place of stone and shadow, of winding staircases and forgotten histories. Dreadmore Castle, a fortress on a storm-lashed island, where the line between the living and the dead is as thin as the coastal fog. A gathering of family, a reading of a will, a night of simmering resentment. But when the great clock strikes 12, an ancient tradition will be broken by a scream in the darkness. This is a story of a murder in a place where everyone is a prisoner and everyone has a skeleton in the armory. This is Murder in the Midnight Castle. For those who enjoy a classic mystery, steeped in atmosphere and suspense, make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have activated all notifications. You wouldn't want to miss a single clue when the lights go out. Now, pour yourself something warm, pull your chair closer to the fire, and listen. The storm is rolling in. Arthur Penhaligon was a man who appreciated the finality of a good lock. It was a preference born from 15 years at Scotland Yard, a career that had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a door closing on his reputation. Now a private consultant in historical authentication, he found a grim irony in being summoned to the most remote and inescapable lockbox in all of Scotland, Dreadmore Castle. The castle was a jagged tooth of granite piercing the bruised purple sky, an island fortress accessible only by a single ferry that ran twice a day, weather permitting. And tonight, the weather was not permitting. A vicious autumn storm was clawing its way in from the North Sea, turning the water into a churning cauldron of gray and white. Penhaligon stood on the ferry's slick deck, the salty spray stinging his face, and felt the profound, oppressive isolation of the place settle over him like a shroud. This wasn't a castle. It was a cage. He had been hired by Lord Alistair Falkirk, the castle's tyrannical and fabulously wealthy master, for a task that was both simple and lucrative, to authenticate a recently discovered Rembrandt sketch before a planned auction. It was a quiet, academic job, a welcome respite from the messy business of human fallibility he had once trafficked in. Alistair Falkirk had summoned not just Penhaligon, but his entire dysfunctional family, for what he called the Midnight Proclamation, a once-a-decade tradition of theatrical cruelty where he would announce his latest revisions to his will. It was, Penhaligon gathered, less a family reunion and more a gathering of vultures, each circling, waiting for the old lion to finally die. He was met at the stone quay by a dour, silent man who introduced himself only as Graves, the butler, and was led up a winding path to the castle proper. Inside, Dreadmore was a masterpiece of Gothic gloom. Suits of armor stood sentinel in the shadows, their metal helms seeming to watch him with empty, accusing eyes. Tapestries depicting brutal, bloody hunts covered the damp stone walls, and the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, old stone, and decay. The family was assembled for dinner in the great hall, a cavernous room dominated by a fireplace large enough to roast an ox and a long, refectory table lit by a constellation of candelabras. The atmosphere was as cold as the stone floor. Lord Alistair Falkirk sat at the head of the table, a hawk-faced patriarch with eyes like chips of ice and a cruel twist to his thin lips. He was a man who wielded his fortune like a weapon, and his family were his primary targets. To his right sat his heir, Julian, a man in his late 30s with a weak chin and the perpetually anxious look of someone living on borrowed time and money. His resentment toward his father was a palpable thing, a low hum of energy in the room. Across from him was Lady Isolde Falkirk, Alistair's third wife, a woman of breathtaking beauty and an age that was scandalously closer to Julian's than to her husband's. She wore her diamonds like armor, but her eyes held a desperate, hunted look. At the far end of the table, as far from her father as physically possible, was Alara Falkirk, the disinherited daughter. A talented but volatile artist, she was dressed in severe black, her face a mask of defiant contempt. She hadn't spoken to her father in years, and her presence was a mystery and a source of visible tension. Completing the tableau were two non-family members. Marcus Sterling, a ruthless business rival of Alistair's, whose invitation was a clear power play on the Old Lord's part, and Dr. Eris Finch, the quiet, unassuming family physician, a man who seemed to shrink into the shadows, his face a study in nervous placation. The dinner was a torturous affair, a symphony of clinking silver, strained silences, and Alistair's biting remarks. He took a sadistic pleasure in setting his guests against one another, making veiled threats about the contents of his will and reminding them all of their absolute dependence on his largesse. "Enjoying the wine, Julian?" Alistair had sneered. "It's a 1945 Bordeaux. Costs more than your last failed business venture. I trust you won't be acquiring a taste for it." Julian's face had flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, but he said nothing. After the meal, the group retired to the library, a circular room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. It was here the proclamation was to take place. The storm had now fully arrived, the wind shrieking around the castle's turrets like a banshee, and the rain lashing against the tall, arched windows. The ferry, they were informed by a grim-faced Graves, would not be running for at least 2 days. They were trapped. Alistair stood before the grand fireplace, a document in his hand. "As you all know," he began, his voice dripping with theatrical gravity, "at the stroke of midnight, I will reveal the new disposition of the Falkirk estate. Some of you will be disappointed, others perhaps surprised." His cold eyes swept across the room, lingering on each of them, savoring their discomfort. A magnificent grandfather clock in the corner of the room began to chime the hour. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the roaring of the storm. Dong, dong, dong. On the 7th chime, the impossible happened. The lights in the library, and indeed the entire castle, flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into absolute, disorienting darkness. A collective gasp went through the room. A moment of confused silence, and then a woman's sharp, terrified scream. It was cut short. It was followed by a heavy, wet thud. Panic erupted. Julian was shouting for lights. Isolde was whimpering. Sterling was cursing. Penhaligon's old instincts took over. "Nobody move," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stay exactly where you are." He fumbled in his jacket for the small pocket torch he always carried. After a few tense seconds, his thumb found the switch, and a thin, white beam cut through the oppressive blackness. He swept the light across the room, past the frozen, terrified faces of the guests. He aimed the beam at the fireplace, where Alistair had been standing. Lord Alistair Falkirk was on the floor, lying face down on the bearskin rug. A pool of dark, glistening liquid was spreading rapidly across the white fur. Protruding from the center of his back was the hilt of an ornate, silver dagger. It was a Sgiandub, a ceremonial Scottish knife. Penhaligon recognized it instantly. It had been part of a collection in a glass display case on the far wall. He rushed to the body, his fingers searching for a pulse at the neck. There was nothing. The eyes were open, fixed in a final, shocked expression. Lord Alistair Falkirk was dead. As the others stared in silent, horrified disbelief, Graves the butler appeared in the doorway, a candelabra held high, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that turned the library into a grotesque theater of the macabre. "The generator has failed, my lord," Graves said, his voice as steady as stone. Then his eyes fell upon the body, and for the first time, a flicker of emotion shock, or perhaps something else crossed his stoic face. Penhaligon stood up, his mind racing. The lights going out was no accident. The scream, the single, precise blow. This was a calculated, perfectly timed execution. The storm had cut them off from the world. The police wouldn't be able to get here for days. He looked at the faces illuminated by the candlelight, a gallery of fear, shock, and, in some eyes, a chillingly absent grief. He was no longer a consultant. He was a detective again. And he was locked in a stone cage, miles from civilization, with a family of vipers and a murderer. The first rule of a homicide investigation is to secure the scene. The second is to assume everyone is lying. Arthur Penhaligon found himself reverting to the old, familiar catechism as if he had never left the yard. While the Falkirk family and their guests stood in a state of shock, he took command. "Graves," he said, his voice a low, authoritative calm that cut through the rising hysteria. "Lock this room. No one enters or leaves. Then go and check the generator. I want to know if it failed or if it was encouraged to fail." The butler, his face an impassive mask once more, simply nodded and withdrew, locking the heavy oak door from the outside with a resounding click. "The rest of you," Penhaligon continued, turning his sharp gaze on the assembled group, "will wait in the great hall. Do not speak to one another about what you have just seen. Do not speak to one another at all." He was met with a mixture of fear and indignant protest. "Who do you think you are?" Julian blustered, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You're just some art dealer." "I was a detective inspector with Scotland Yard for 15 years, specializing in homicide," Penhaligon replied, his voice flat and cold. "And until the authorities can get here, that is exactly who I am again. Now move." His quiet confidence, and the stark reality of the murder, silenced any further argument. One by one, they filed out, leaving Penhaligon alone with the dead man and the echoing silence of the castle. He began his examination. The dagger was, as he suspected, from the display case. The glass had been shattered. The blow was precise, delivered with significant force, piercing the thick tweed of Alistair's jacket and finding its way directly between the shoulder blades. The killer knew what they were doing. The document Alistair had been holding, the new will, was gone. It wasn't on the floor, not on the mantelpiece, not clutched in his dead hand. In a room full of people whose futures depended on that piece of paper, its disappearance was as significant as the murder itself. The motive, it seemed, was lying in plain sight. Kill the testator and destroy the unfavorable will. Graves returned 10 minutes later, his expression grim. "The generator was tampered with, sir. The main fuel line was deliberately severed. A clean cut. It was timed to fail." "Of course it was," Penhaligon murmured. "This confirmed it. This was premeditated, planned with an intimate knowledge of the castle's workings." For the rest of the night, Penhaligon worked. He sketched the crime scene, took notes on the position of the body, and examined the display case. There were no obvious fingerprints, but the killer had likely worn gloves. He then began the grim task of interviewing the suspects in the cold, cavernous great hall. He spoke to each of them alone, with the others sent to the far side of the hall, watched over by the stoic Graves. Julian Falkirk was first. The son and heir was a wreck, alternating between blustering rage and a terrified, almost childlike panic. "I was standing by the window," he claimed. "When the lights went out, I just froze. I heard the scream. I didn't see anything." He admitted to hating his father, and to the crushing debts that made his inheritance a matter of life and death. "He was going to cut me off completely. He told me so this morning. He called me a failure. He was going to leave everything to a bloody charity for cats." The motive was screamingly obvious, which, in Penhaligon's experience, often made it a lie. Lady Isolde, the young widow, was a study in practiced grief. She wept into a silk handkerchief, her beautiful face a mask of sorrow, but her eyes were cold and calculating. "Alistair was a difficult man," she admitted, her voice a delicate sob. "But I loved him." Penhaligon pressed her. He knew of the ironclad prenuptial agreement that would leave her with a pittance if she divorced him, but a fortune if he died. She denied everything, claiming she was by the fireplace, farthest from the door and from her husband. Her performance was almost flawless, but Penhaligon noted the slight, involuntary clenching of her fists. Alara, the estranged daughter, was defiant. "Yes, I hated him," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He was a monster. He destroyed my mother and tried to destroy me. Am I sad he's dead? No. Did I kill him? Don't be ridiculous." Murder is so uncreative. She claimed she was near the bookshelves on the opposite side of the room from the display case. She offered no alibi, no defense, only a chilling indifference that was, in its own way, as suspicious as Isolde's over-the-top grief. Marcus Sterling, the business rival, was cool and analytical. Alistair's death is convenient for my company. I won't deny it, he said calmly. But this is messy, unprofessional. I was near the door, speaking with Dr. Finch. We were both taken by surprise. He projected an aura of detached logic, but Penhaligon sensed a deep, cold anger simmering just beneath the surface. Finally, there was Dr. Finch. The physician was a bundle of nerves, his hands trembling as he spoke. It's a terrible shock. Terrible, he stammered. He confirmed he was with Sterling near the door. He seemed to have the strongest alibi. But as Penhaligon questioned him about Alistair's health, the doctor became evasive. Was Lord Falkirk suffering from any serious medical conditions? Penhaligon asked a standard question. Finch hesitated, his eyes darting around the hall. Patient confidentiality. I cannot say. A man has been murdered, Doctor. Penhaligon pressed, his voice hardening. Confidentiality is a luxury we can no longer afford. Finch swallowed hard. He was unwell, yes, but it was not immediately life-threatening. The lie was as transparent as glass. The doctor was hiding something crucial. By the time the weak, gray dawn broke through the storm clouds, Penhaligon had a handful of motives, a cast of liars, and no concrete evidence. He decided to search the guests' rooms. It was a breach of privacy, but he wasn't a police officer anymore. He was operating on his own authority, and the authority of the dead man in the library. He started with Julian's suite. It was a mess of expensive clothes and unpaid bills. Tucked inside a book, Penhaligon found a letter from a loan shark, the threats within it escalating to a terrifying degree. Julian wasn't just in debt. He was in danger. In Isolde's room, hidden in a jewelry box, he found not jewels, but a collection of passionate love letters, signed simply with the initial M. They spoke of a secret plan, of a future together, once she was free. Was M for Marcus Sterling? It was a tantalizing possibility. Alara's room was sparse, almost monastic. It was a guest room, not her childhood bedroom. He found nothing but sketchbooks filled with dark, angry, brilliant drawings. Many of them depicted a hawk-faced man being consumed by shadows. They were disturbing, but they weren't evidence of murder. But it was in Alistair's own grand suite that Penhaligon made the most significant discovery. The room was a museum of the man's ego, filled with hunting trophies and portraits of himself. A large, ornate desk stood by the window. It was locked. After a few minutes of careful work with a set of tension wrenches, Penhaligon opened it. Inside, beneath a stack of financial ledgers, he found a hidden compartment. And within that compartment, he found a small, leather-bound diary. It was not Alistair's. The handwriting was feminine, dated 30 years prior. It belonged to Alistair's first wife, Alara's mother, who had supposedly died in a tragic riding accident. Penhaligon began to read. The diary painted a portrait of a woman living in terror of her abusive, controlling husband. But it was the last few entries that made his blood run cold. She wrote of a terrible secret, a sin of the father that Alistair had committed to secure his inheritance. She claimed that Alistair's younger brother, believed to have died in a boating accident as a child, had been murdered, and she had found proof. He knows that I know, the final entry read. He looks at me with the same cold eyes he must have used on his own brother. I have hidden the proof in the safest place I can think of, the heart of the castle. He will never find it. I fear for my life, and I fear for my daughter, for what this truth will do to her. A day later, her horse had bolted, and she was found dead at the bottom of a ravine. An accident. Penhaligon closed the diary, a profound chill settling over him. This wasn't just about a will. This was about a secret that had festered in the heart of the Falkirk family for a generation. Alistair hadn't just been a tyrant. He had been a murderer, and his wife had known. Had he killed her, too? And what was this proof she had hidden? He looked out the window at the raging sea. The castle wasn't just a cage. It was a tomb, built on a foundation of lies and blood, and the whispers of its oldest ghosts were finally beginning to speak. The discovery of the First Lady Falkirk's diary shifted the very foundations of the case. Penhaligon now understood that he was not investigating a simple crime of passion or greed hatched in the last 24 hours. He was excavating a multi-generational conspiracy. The murder of Alistair Falkirk was not the beginning of the story. It was the bloody, long-overdue final chapter. Armed with this new knowledge, he reevaluated everything. The missing will was no longer just a document of inheritance. It was potentially a confession. What if Alistair, facing his own mortality, had decided to finally unburden his conscience in the most dramatic way possible? What if the Midnight Proclamation was not about disinheriting his ungrateful children, but about revealing the truth of his stolen legacy and naming the rightful heir the descendant of his murdered brother? Such a revelation would not only disinherit Julian, Isolde, and Alara, but would brand the Falkirk name with the stain of fratricide. The motive for murder had just expanded exponentially. Someone had killed Alistair not to prevent their own disinheritance, but to prevent the revelation of a far darker truth. His next move was to confront Dr. Finch. He found the physician in his room, packing his medical bag with trembling hands as if he could somehow will the fairy to appear. Penhaligon closed the door behind him. "I'm going to ask you again, doctor," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What was wrong with Lord Falkirk?" He placed the diary on the table between them. "And I would advise you not to lie to me this time." Finch stared at the diary, his face draining of all color. He sank onto the bed, his composure finally shattering. "It was brain cancer," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "Inoperable. He was given 6 months to live at most. He was in immense pain, but he refused medication. He wanted clarity," he said, "for the end. This was the missing piece. A dying man. It explained everything. Why murder a man who was already on his deathbed? Because you weren't trying to stop him from living. You were trying to stop him from talking." "He was going to confess," Finch continued, not looking at Penhaligon. "He told me last week. He said he wanted to cleanse the house before he died. He'd spent a fortune on private investigators, and he'd found him. His brother's grandson. The boy his brother had secretly fathered just before his accident. Alistair was going to name him as the sole heir to the entire Falkirk estate. He was going to expose the whole sordid story." Penhaligon felt the final tumblers of the lock click into place. The killer was someone who knew about Alistair's terminal diagnosis and his plan to confess. Someone who had the most to lose, not from a change in the will, but from the public disgrace the truth would bring. He left Finch to his nervous collapse and went in search of the heart of the castle. The phrase from the diary echoed in his mind. It was a riddle. Where would a terrified woman hide proof of a murder in a place with 1,000 hiding spots? He thought about the castle's layout, its history. The heart of any great keep was its oldest part, its foundation. The crypt? The dungeons? Too obvious. He thought about Lady Falkirk. She was a mother. She feared for her daughter. The heart of the castle. His mind turned to the castle's chapel, a small, cold, disused space on the ground floor. It was the oldest part of the structure, built on the original foundations. At the center of the chapel was a stone altar, and behind it, a large, faded tapestry depicting the Falkirk family tree. He ran his hands along the cold stone of the altar, along the walls, the pews. Nothing. Frustrated, he stood back, looking at the tapestry. It was a monument to the family's vanity, a lineage of stony-faced lords and their pale wives. He saw Alistair's name, and beside it, the name of his younger brother, Ewan, with a single, stark date beside it. Died 1958. He traced the lineage back, his eyes scanning the intricate needlework. And then he saw it. A single, loose thread at the base of the tapestry, near the depiction of the castle's foundation stone. He pulled at the thread. It came away easily, revealing a tiny, almost invisible keyhole in the stone wall, hidden behind the fabric. He had no key, but the lock was ancient. Using 2 thin metal picks from his kit, he probed the mechanism. After a tense minute of delicate work, he heard a soft click. A section of the stone wall ground inward, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside was a small, wax-sealed metal box. He carried it to the light. The seal was that of the First Lady Falkirk. He broke it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, corroded object. It was a silver locket. He opened it. On one side was a faded photograph of a young, smiling Manuan Falkirk. On the other side, there was no picture, but a tiny, folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it. It was a handwritten note. Alistair did this. He held my head under the water. If you are reading this, he has killed me too. Avenge us. Your loving father, Ewan. But it wasn't the note that was the real proof. It was the locket itself. On the back, almost obscured by tarnish, was a fresh inscription, one that had clearly been added long after the locket was made. It read, A.F. Alistair Falkirk. It was his trophy, the psychopathic signature of a killer who couldn't resist claiming his prize. As Penhaligon stood there, holding the definitive proof of a 50-year-old crime, he heard a sound from the chapel doorway. He turned to see Ilara Falkirk standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terrible understanding. I knew there was a secret, she whispered, her voice trembling. I could always feel it. This house is built on bones. My mother, she tried to tell me, but I was just a child. She told me to always watch the family tree. Before Penhaligon could respond, a new and more immediate threat made itself known. A low, scraping sound echoed from the far end of the chapel, near the entrance to the old armory. A shadow moved in the doorway. The killer, realizing the secret was out, was no longer content to hide. The hunt was coming to a close, and the prey was now turning on the hunter. A floorboard creaked above them. Someone was in the rafters of the chapel, watching them. The castle was closing in, its secrets no longer content to be whispered. They were now screaming for a final, bloody resolution. The chapel, once a place of quiet decay, was now a tinderbox of tension. Penhaligon stood with the locket in his palm, a cold, heavy piece of truth, while Ilara stared, her life's unspoken anxieties finally given a name and a face. The sounds from the armory and the rafters above confirmed Penhaligon's grim realization. He had flushed the killer out, but in doing so had cornered them. And a cornered rat will always bite. Get behind the altar, he ordered Ilara, his voice a low command. He drew his .38, a weapon he hadn't fired in years, but whose weight felt as familiar as his own hands. The shadows in the chapel seemed to deepen, the stone saints in their niches looking on with indifferent eyes. The figure in the armory doorway stepped into the faint light. It was Marcus Sterling, the business rival, his face a mask of cold fury. He held a heavy, antique pistol from one of the castle's displays. I should have known the old man kept trophies, Sterling said, his voice a low snarl. Give me the locket, Penhaligon. This ends now. At the same moment, a second figure dropped from the rafters, landing with a silent grace that spoke of practice. It was Julian Falkirk, his face slick with sweat, a length of rope in his hands. He works for me, Julian shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate, manic energy. We had a deal. We were going to expose him together, force him to give me my inheritance. It was a conspiracy, but a clumsy, ill-conceived one. Penhaligon saw it in a flash. Sterling wasn't the killer. He was an opportunist. He and Julian had likely formed a desperate alliance to blackmail Alistair, using some piece of leverage Sterling had. The murder had thrown their plan into chaos. Your father was murdered, Julian, Penhaligon said, his gun steady, his eyes moving between the two men. Was that part of your deal? No, Julian cried. He was supposed to be terrified, not dead. Someone else. Someone got to him first. As if on cue, the true final piece of the puzzle fell into place. From the main entrance of the chapel, a third figure appeared, stepping out from behind a pillar. It was Graves, the butler. His stoic demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of profound, weary sadness. And in his hand, he held a small, modern pistol, its black metal a stark contrast to the castle's ancient stone. "They are all fools, sir," Graves said, his voice resonating with an authority Penhaligon had never heard. So much noise, so much greed. They never understood what was truly at stake. Sterling and Julian spun around, their own weapons wavering as they were caught in a three-way standoff. "Graves," Alara whispered from behind the altar. "You." "My name is not Graves," the man said, his eyes fixed on Penhaligon. "My name is Ewan Falkirk. I am the grandson of the man your host murdered. I am the rightful heir to this castle." The confession hung in the air, more shocking than any gunshot. He explained it all with a chilling, quiet clarity. His grandfather, Ewan, had had a secret child. That child, his father, had lived a quiet life, knowing the truth of his stolen legacy but too afraid to act. He had passed the story and the burning sense of injustice down to his son. The man who called himself Graves had spent years planning his return, taking the position of butler to get inside the castle, to learn its secrets, to wait for his moment. He was the unknown beneficiary in Alistair's new will. "Alistair found me," Ewan/Graves explained. "His investigators were good. He was going to name me his heir, to confess. But he wanted to do it on his terms, in his own cruel, theatrical way. Couldn't allow that. This wasn't his story to tell. It was my family's." The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. He knew the castle's layout, the generator, the secret passages. He had killed Alistair during the blackout he had engineered. He had taken the new will not to destroy it, but to preserve it as proof of his own claim. The dagger from the case was poetic justice. He had framed the greedy family, knowing they would turn on each other like starving dogs. "What about the diary? The locket?" Penhaligon asked, his mind racing. "I knew nothing of those," Ewan admitted. "They were a complication, an unexpected gift from the castle's ghosts." The standoff was at a breaking point. Julian, seeing his last hope of an inheritance vanish, let out a desperate cry and lunged at Ewan. It was a foolish, fatal mistake. Ewan fired his pistol once, the sound deafening in the stone chapel. Julian crumpled to the floor, a single dark hole in his chest. Sterling, seeing his own life on the line, fired his antique pistol at Ewan. The hammer clicked on a dud round. The gun, like the family, was a relic, all show and no substance. Ewan turned his pistol toward Sterling. Penhaligon didn't hesitate. He fired his .38. The shot was true, hitting Ewan in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his gun to clatter across the stone floor. Alara screamed. It was over. The echoes of the gunshots faded, replaced by the howling of the wind and the ragged sound of breathing. Julian was dead. Sterling was frozen in terror. Ewan was on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of agony and defeated rage. His long-planned, meticulous revenge had unraveled in a storm of unpredictable human greed and a single, determined investigator. The storm broke at dawn. The sound of a helicopter's rotors slicing through the air was the sound of the outside world finally breaking through the castle's isolation. The police arrived to a scene of carnage and confession, a story that would become a modern legend. Weeks later, Arthur Penhaligon sat in his quiet London flat, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The Falkirk case was closed. Ewan Graves Falkirk had confessed to everything. The fortune, tied up in legal battles, would likely go to the state. Alara, the last surviving Falkirk of her line, had disappeared, seeking a quiet life away from the blood-soaked stones of her ancestral home. Penhaligon looked at the Rembrandt sketch which he had authenticated before the murder. It was a portrait of an old man, his face a landscape of wisdom and regret. He had solved the murder, untangled the secrets, and brought the truth to light. He had faced the ghosts of Dreadmore Castle and had, in a way, laid his own to rest. The door to his past at Scotland Yard no longer felt so finally, horribly closed. There was still work to be done in the world, still shadows to be illuminated. The thought brought him not dread, but a quiet, weary sense of purpose. He took a sip of his whiskey and watched the city lights flicker on, each one a potential story, a new secret waiting to be told.